So, Steven Universe. If you were around when this show first started airing, you probably remember that it didn't immediately look like what it turned out to be. The first handful of episodes are genuinely charming and a bit goofy. Steven is a round, enthusiastic kid who lives in a beach town with 3 alien women who fight monsters and have gems embedded in their bodies. His mum isn't around. He really likes his dad, who lives in a van. He eats a lot of donuts. And then, somewhere around episode 52, the show reveals that one of his guardians has been a fusion of 2 different beings the entire time. That those 2 beings fell in love thousands of years ago and decided to stay fused because that felt more right than being separate, and that this fact is essentially the emotional spine of everything the show has ever wanted to say. That's a bit of a leap from the donuts. Rebecca Sugar, the creator, has been pretty open about the fact that fusion in Steven Universe is a metaphor for relationships. All kinds of relationships. That's the broad intention, and it's the one that gets cited most often. But what I think is more interesting, and what makes the show worth spending a few hours thinking about, late at night, is the way it handles the version of that metaphor that goes wrong. The dark half of the spectrum. Because fusion in Steven Universe exists on a spectrum. On one end, you've got Garnet, who is Ruby and Sapphire, 2 gems who met under extraordinary circumstances, formed a bond so immediate and overwhelming that they accidentally fused on the spot, and then chose to stay that way for thousands of years because being together felt like the truest thing either of them had ever experienced. That's the light end of things. On the other end, buried somewhere miles beneath the Earth's surface, is something made of millions of shattered gem fragments that were force-fused against any conceivable notion of consent, and turned into a weapon designed to destroy the planet. That's the dark end. And the show treats both of these things with complete seriousness, which is sort of remarkable. Tonight we're going through the fusions that live on the darker half of that spectrum. Not all of them are villainous, exactly. Some of them are deeply sympathetic. Some of them are uncomfortable in a way that's hard to articulate at first but becomes clearer the longer you sit with it. A few of them are just genuinely upsetting once you understand what the show's actually saying. There's quite a lot to get through, so we'll be here a while. That's sort of the point. If you're settling in for the night, or you're doing something quiet and you want something to listen to, we'll be covering everything from the first time the show flagged that fusion could go badly, all the way through to the massive wartime atrocities the Diamonds committed using forced fusion as a weapon. It's quite the range. One thing that's worth knowing going in, if you're not deeply familiar with the show, Steven Universe ran from 2013 to 2019, with a movie in 2019 and an epilogue series called Steven Universe Future that ran through early 2020. The fusion lore we're going to be talking about tonight spans the full run of all of it, so we'll be moving across seasons and touching on things that happen quite late in the story. If you haven't finished the show and you'd rather keep certain things a surprise, this is a good moment to know that. But for a video like this, it's hard to talk about the dark side of fusion without talking about why the darkness matters, and that requires some of the bigger revelations. So, fair warning. If you enjoy this kind of thing and you'd like more of it, subscribing is a nice way to make that happen. But no pressure. We'll get into it now. So before we get into any of the specific fusions I want to talk about tonight, it's worth spending a bit of time on what fusion actually is in this universe mechanically and philosophically, because the dark versions only make sense once you understand what the healthy version is supposed to look like. On the surface level, fusion is when 2 or more gems synchronize and merge into a single new being. They touch, or they dance, or they just kind of will it into happening. And then there's this transformation sequence and a new character appears. The new character is bigger. They have a combined set of abilities. Their physical features are a blend of their components. They have a name that's usually a different gemstone entirely, separate from either of the gems who formed them. But the more interesting thing is what happens to the minds involved. When 2 gems fuse, they don't become 2 personalities sharing one body, like passengers in a car. They become something genuinely new. A third thing. Garnet isn't Ruby and Sapphire taking turns at the controls. Garnet is Garnet, with her own sense of self and her own way of being in the world, who also happens to be made of ruby and sapphire's love for each other. That distinction matters a lot to the show. And the character of the new fusion reflects the relationship that produced it. That's the engine of the metaphor. A fusion born of genuine trust and care produces a stable, grounded being who feels complete. A fusion born of conflict or coercion or obsession produces something that's unstable, fractured, or in some cases monstrous. The fusion itself is almost like a readout of the relationship's health, which is clever, honestly. Now, something worth knowing about Homeworld's official position on all this. For most of gem history, cross-gem fusion was considered deeply inappropriate. Two gems of the same type fusing for tactical purposes was fine. Two rubies becoming a bigger ruby was acceptable. But two different gems merging into something new, something that didn't fit any pre-established category, that was considered deviant. The word the show uses is disgusting, which gives you a sense of how strong the social taboo was. The reason Homeworld had that rule is never spelled out completely, but you can piece it together. The Diamond Authority ran a very rigidly hierarchical society, where every gem had a type and a function and a place in the order. A pearl was a pearl. An amethyst was an amethyst. Knowing what category something belonged to told you exactly how to treat it and what to expect from it. A cross-gem fusion was something that didn't fit any category. It was unpredictable. It had its own personality that might not align with what either of its components was designed for. You couldn't classify it. And in a society built on classification, that was threatening. Garnet is, in a lot of ways, a walking act of rebellion just by existing. The Homeworld gems who encounter her in the flashback episode The Answer are genuinely disturbed by her in a way that goes beyond just not knowing what she is. She represents something that shouldn't be possible according to the rules they've been given. That context is important for understanding why the show treats fusion as something sacred, or as close to sacred as this show gets. When the crystal gems fuse, it's framed as an intimate act of trust, not always romantic but always meaningful. Pearl and amethyst's fusion, opal, is fascinating precisely because pearl and amethyst don't always get on. And the fact that they can still fuse into something functional says something about the affection underneath the friction. Garnet teaching Stephen and Connie to fuse into Stevonnie is treated almost like a rite of passage. And then you have the other side of the coin, which is where tonight lives. Because the show is just as precise about what a bad fusion looks like. Bad fusions don't hold together properly. They're volatile or unstable, or they develop identities that are angry and hard to reason with. The components can be felt fighting inside them. The physical forms reflect the internal conflict, not in an abstract way, but quite literally. Malachite, for instance, has a body that's two torsos joined like a centaur, two centers of gravity, because Jasper and Lapis couldn't even agree on the shape they should inhabit. Rebecca Sugar has talked in interviews about fusion representing all kinds of relationships and not specifically romantic ones. Fusion can be friendship, creative partnership, codependency, family. The dark fusions map onto the dark versions of those things. Sugalite is what you might get if you think about relationships as a place to escape yourself rather than to know yourself better. Malachite is built on coercion and spite. The cluster gems are Homeworld's war crimes compressed into bodies that can't stop screaming. The metaphor holds at every scale, from the deeply personal to the genuinely horrific. One more thing to establish. Before we get into specifics, the show draws a distinction between being fused and being in a fusion. That's a subtle thing, but it turns out to be important. Garnet is always fused, in the sense that she is always ruby and sapphire. But she experiences herself as Garnet, a single being. She doesn't feel like she's fused. She just is. The unhealthy fusions, the ones we're going to talk about, often involve gems who are aware of the seam, who feel the other consciousness pushing against them, who haven't resolved into something unified. They're in a fusion in a way that Garnet isn't. They're two things badly stitched together, rather than one thing that became. That distinction is maybe the most useful lens for everything we're going to cover tonight, and there's a related idea that I think is worth flagging before we move forward. which is the concept of what the show calls an unstable fusion. Stability in fusion, the show implies, comes from the relationship being stable. Garnet is perfectly stable because Ruby and Sapphire's love for each other is settled and sure. They've been together for thousands of years. They know who they are. They trust each other completely. There are no unresolved tensions in their pulling at the seams. An unstable fusion, by contrast, is one where the components are fighting each other, or where the foundation the fusion was built on is cracked. Alexandrite, the fusion of garnet, amethyst, and pearl, is technically possible but tends to hold together imperfectly when the three of them are having disagreements, because the fusion is a live reflection of the state of their relationships. In one episode, she nearly diffuses during a dinner because Pearl won't eat, and Amethyst insists on it, and Garnet is trying to mediate, and the fusion's coherence keeps flickering. It's played partly for comedy, but the underlying logic is consistent. You can't build something stable out of unstable components, and fusion makes that truth impossible to ignore. It's also worth knowing that gems can fuse with humans, which is unusual. Stevani, the fusion of Steven and his friend Connie, is technically unprecedented, or was when they first accidentally fused in the second season. Steven is half human. Connie is fully human with no gem component at all. The fact that they can fuse is partly because Steven is the kind of gem he is, and partly because the connection between them is genuine enough to make it possible. Stevani is one of the show's most straightforwardly joyful fusions, which is nice given the subject of tonight's discussion. But the existence of human gem fusion does create some uncomfortable implications when you start thinking about the cluster gems. Because if consciousness and connection are enough to make fusion possible, what does it mean that beings who can't consent at all, beings who are just fragments, can be forced together by pressure? The show's answer seems to be that forced fusion is possible but produces something fundamentally wrong, something that's a fusion in form but not in spirit. A body without the thing that makes a fusion more than the sum of its parts. One more thing on the mechanics before we start talking about specific cases. The question of memory in fusion is interesting. When two gems fuse, they bring their memories to the fusion, and the fusion is aware of those memories. But the fusion itself doesn't automatically share memories between the components that they didn't have before the fusion. So if Pearl knows something that Garnet doesn't, and they fuse into Sardonyx, Sardonyx has both of their memories up to the point of fusion, but Garnet within the fusion doesn't suddenly learn what Pearl knew. The memories are accessible to the fusion entity, but they're not necessarily transferred between the components. This becomes significant in the Sardonyx arc, as we'll see, and it's relevant to Malachite too, in a different way. The show is careful about this. It never uses fusion as a shortcut to share information or resolve misunderstandings. If you want someone to know something, you have to tell them. Fusion doesn't do it for you. One more thing that I think clarifies the whole spectrum we'll be talking about tonight. There's an episode in the first season, Giant Woman, where Steven wants to see Pearl and Amethyst fuse, and he doesn't understand why they won't just do it on command. He thinks of fusion as a power-up, a tactical upgrade. He doesn't understand yet that asking two gems to fuse is asking something of their relationship, not of their compatibility. By the end of the series, he understands it entirely. But that initial misunderstanding, Steven thinking fusion is a tool and gradually learning it isn't, maps onto the journey the audience takes. We start watching this show thinking fusion is a cool anime power, and we end understanding it as a way the show talks about intimacy and trust and the cost of connection. The visual vocabulary is doing a lot of work, and it only adds up across the whole series. All of that context is what makes the dark fusions dark. Not the design, not the power level, not even the destruction they cause. It's the relationship underneath. It's the thing the fusion says about how those two beings relate to each other. Anyway, the first time the show really flags that fusion can go badly isn't the big dramatic horror of Malachite. It's something quieter. Something that at first looks almost like a cool action sequence and takes a little while to reveal its actual shape. Let's start there. To understand Sugalite properly, you need to understand Amethyst. Not completely, but enough. Amethyst is a crystal gem who came out of what's called the kindergarten. which is basically a gem production facility. Gems are grown in planets, incubated underground, and when they're ready, they emerge. The kindergarten on Earth was supposed to produce a large batch of quartz soldiers. The war with the crystal gems got in the way of that. Homeworld abandoned the facility, and most of those soldiers never emerged. Amethyst did. She came out thousands of years late, alone, with no instructions and no purpose, and eventually found her way to the crystal gems. Here's the thing, the show eventually reveals. Amethyst came out wrong. She stayed in the ground too long, and the Earth didn't have enough resources left for her by the time she emerged. So she came out smaller than a quartz is supposed to be. She knows this. She's known it for a long time. It's a wound she carries around, and Mosley copes with by being loud and funny and acting like she doesn't care about anything very much. She has a complicated relationship with her own existence, is the short version. She doesn't feel like she belongs anywhere completely. She loves being a crystal gem, but she also knows she wasn't really supposed to be one, or supposed to be anything, because the whole purpose she was made for got cancelled before she even emerged. There's this moment in a later episode where she goes back to the kindergarten and basically has a breakdown about it. Because the kindergarten is genuinely disturbing, the ground is full of these empty holes where gems were grown and then just never came out, and she is intimately aware that she came from that. So Amethyst has a specific kind of vulnerability around her own identity. Around the question of whether she's enough, whether the version of herself she is valid, whether she measures up to what she was supposed to be. Now, Garnet and Amethyst fuse into Sugalite in the Season 1 episode Coach Steven. The mission is to take down a communications tower. Garnet and Amethyst fuse because the tower requires a lot of brute force, and two gems working together are more efficient than two gems working separately. That's the practical reasoning. They fuse, Sugalite shows up, Sugalite is enormous and chaotic and demolishes things, and then they don't come back. Sugalite is massive. She's described as being around the same size as Alexandrite, which is herself a 3-gem fusion. She has 5 eyes, a huge cloud of dark purple hair, 4 arms, and this energy that's immediately distinguishable from their Garnet or Amethyst because it's more volatile than either of them. Garnet is controlled and deliberate. Amethyst is impulsive but affectionate. Sugalite is both of those things turned up past comfortable. And then the dial ripped off. She's powerful and she knows it, and she likes it. She's voiced by Nicki Minaj, which honestly makes complete sense once you hear it. The problem is that Garnet and Amethyst stop wanting to come back. They're supposed to do the mission and then separate, but Sugalite just keeps being Sugalite. They lose themselves in her. And Pearl, who has stayed behind on the beach, starts to worry and eventually goes to find them. And what she finds is Sugalite refusing to diffuse, contemptuous of Pearl, increasingly unable to hear any voice except her own. The line Pearl says about it is worth sitting with. She says Garnet and Amethyst are losing themselves in the fusion, and then Sugalite responds, "I am myself and I'm sick of being split up." That response is one of the more precise things the show does. Sugalite doesn't feel like she's a fusion gone wrong. She feels like she's the real thing, and the separation is the problem. She's developed enough of her own sense of self that she believes she's the entity that should exist, not the two halves she's made of. She's not holding Garnet and Amethyst captive. From her perspective, she is what Garnet and Amethyst become when they stop limiting themselves. The fight between Pearl and Sugalite is uncomfortable to watch because it's wildly mismatched. Sugalite is a colossal fusion who can flatten buildings. Pearl is small and precise and basically the opposite of what Sugalite represents. Pearl wins. Not through strength, through strategy, because she understands Sugalite in a way Sugalite doesn't understand herself. She knows Sugalite's recklessness is both her greatest strength and her most exploitable weakness. What I find interesting about that fight is that the show frames it so that you understand both sides. Pearl is right that Sugalite needs to stop. But Sugalite isn't wrong that there's something real and genuine in the fusion, something worth preserving. The problem isn't that Sugalite is evil. The problem is that she's consuming two people who have their own lives and their own relationships with each other outside of what she is. After Sugalite diffuses, there's this brief scene where Garnet and Amethyst are both wrecked. They can't move properly. they have what Amethyst describes as a monster headache. That detail, that the damage done to a fusion is carried back to the components when they split, is a small physical reminder of the cost. Sugalite was fun, Sugalite was powerful, and now Garnet and Amethyst are lying on the ground unable to get up. What Sugalite represents on a thematic level is something the show takes seriously without being preachy about it. She's the appeal of disappearing into something bigger than yourself. For Amethyst in particular, who has never felt like she was quite enough, the idea of becoming something massive and powerful and unambiguous must be genuinely intoxicating. Sugalite doesn't have Amethyst's insecurities. Sugalite doesn't have anything so small as insecurities. She just is. There's a version of that appeal that isn't hard to understand from the outside, I think. The exhaustion of maintaining a fragile sense of self and the fantasy of just putting it down for a while. The show doesn't endorse that fantasy, but it takes it seriously enough to portray it as genuinely tempting rather than obviously foolish. Amethyst doesn't fuse with Garnet because she's lazy or thoughtless. She loses herself in Sugalite because some part of her wants to. There's also something going on with Garnet here that's easy to miss on first watch. Garnet is a fusion. Garnet's entire existence is built around the idea that two beings can merge and produce something better than either of them alone. She should understand the appeal of fusion better than anyone. And maybe that's exactly why Sugalite is a particular failure for her. Because she knows what a good fusion looks like. And she knows this isn't it. And she has to reckon with the fact that she participated in something that went wrong in a way she should have seen coming. Garnet doesn't talk about it much after the episode. She's not the type. But the show's framing suggests she carries it. Later, in Season 2, when Pearl starts deceiving her to fuse into Sardonyx, Garnet's reaction is so outsized that it only makes sense if you understand that fusion is something Garnet holds as almost sacred. Sugalite is part of the context for why that betrayal lands as hard as it does. Sugalite shows up in a few later moments across the series, mostly briefly. There's a nice detail in Know Your Fusion, where Sardonyx, who is herself a fusion of Garnet and Pearl, puts up a segment on her show about Sugalite. And there's this gentle acknowledgement in the scene that Sardonyx knows what Sugalite is, that she and Sugalite are in some sense related, and that the difference between them is exactly the thing we've been talking about. The way Garnet formed them, the way the relationship was when the fusion happened. Sardonyx is playful about it, but you can feel the weight underneath. The show doesn't return to Sugalite in any major story way, after Coach Steven, which I actually think is the right choice. Sugalite served her purpose as a story. The show looked at what it wanted to say about that particular kind of loss. The loss of someone into something that absorbs them, and it said it cleanly and completely in one episode. The character who gets used as the second warning and who is in some ways more unsettling than Sugalite precisely because she's so beautiful is someone we'll get to in a moment. But first, a small note on Sugalite's actual gem. Sugalite the gemstone is real. It's a rare pink to purple mineral discovered in Japan in 1944 and named after geologist Kenichi Sugi. It's associated in various metaphysical traditions with things like self-awareness, identity, and the resolution of existential problems. The choice of that specific stone for this specific fusion, given what Sugalite's story is actually about, feels deliberate. The show tends to be thoughtful with its gemstone symbolism. Malachite, which we'll get to, is a stone associated with protection but is also toxic when submerged in water. These choices aren't accidental. Anyway, let's talk about the beautiful one. Now, I want to go back to Amethyst for a second, because there's a conversation she has with Steven much later in the series, in an episode called Crack the Whip, that connects to everything we've been talking about in a way I find meaningful. Steven asks Amethyst about her and Garnet fusing, whether they do it often, and Amethyst is a bit cagey about it. Not ashamed exactly, but careful. Like she's made her peace with the Sugalite episode, but she's also still aware of what it says about something in her. The show never forces a tidy resolution on Amethyst's insecurities. She gets better over the course of the series. She has a major breakthrough in the episode Amethyst and another in Back to the Kindergarten. But the underlying thing, the feeling of having come out wrong, of not being quite enough, doesn't just disappear. It becomes something she manages rather than something she's cured of. That's actually quite a mature way to handle it for a children's show. The implication isn't that Amethyst will never want to lose herself in a fusion again. The implication is that she's learned to notice when that pull is there and to question it, rather than just following it. Something I find interesting about the Sugalite episode specifically is the way it handles Pearl's role in it. Pearl comes off well in the immediate sense. She's the one who raises the alarm. She's the one who fights to defuse Sugalite. She's correct that the situation has gotten out of hand. But the show is also subtly tracking the fact that Pearl's attitude toward Garnet and Amethyst fusing is not entirely neutral. Pearl has strong opinions about fusion. She thinks some fusions are better than others. She values precision and control and elegance. And Sugalite is none of those things. Pearl's concern is genuine, but her judgment about which fusions are acceptable is also partly about Pearl's aesthetic preferences. And the show gently marks that without making it the main point. Pearl's relationship with Garnet and with the idea of fusing with Garnet is complicated in a way that the Sugalite episode lays groundwork for. There's also something worth noting about Garnet's culpability in the Sugalite situation, which the show handles with typical understatement. Garnet decided to fuse with Amethyst. Garnet could have suggested they set a time limit or check in at regular intervals. Garnet, who understands better than anyone what it means when a fusion starts developing its own insistent selfhood, didn't build in any safeguards. That's not a condemnation of Garnet. She's not perfect and the show never pretends she is, but it's a detail. She chose to fuse and then didn't manage the outcome as carefully as she might have. The aftermath, where Garnet apologizes to Steven and Pearl, is brief and not particularly detailed, but it's there. Garnet says she made a mistake. She doesn't elaborate. For Garnet, that's a fairly significant admission. One last thing on Sugalite before we move. Her weapon. Fused gems tend to produce weapons that are combinations of their component weapons. Garnet fights with gauntlets. Amethyst fights with a whip. Sugalite's weapon is a flail, which is essentially a weight on a chain, and it's enormous, and she swings it with this reckless joy that tells you everything about what she's prioritizing. It's not tactical. It's not elegant. It's just massive and chaotic, and she loves it. That weapon is a physical expression of what happens when Garnet's force meets Amethyst's energy with no Pearl-style precision in the mix. It shouldn't be surprising that it breaks things it wasn't supposed to. Now, I want to briefly address something about the way the show structures the Sugalite episode that I find genuinely clever. The episode is called Coach Steven, and the A-plot is about Steven wanting to become stronger and Pearl feeling inadequate compared to Sugalite. On the surface, it's about physical strength and training and feeling left out. That's the version of the episode you get if you're watching it as a kid and taking it at face value. The version of the episode you get when you come back to it knowing everything is about what it looks like when someone you love dissolves into something that doesn't know you exist. Pearl calls for Garnet and Amethyst and they're not there. Sugalite is there. And Sugalite doesn't particularly care about Pearl, not because she's malicious, but because her interest is elsewhere entirely. Pearl is trying to reach two people through a fusion that has absorbed them so completely that their individual relationships don't function anymore. That's not a purely physical problem. It's a problem of presence. Garnet and Amethyst are, in some sense, present inside Sugalite. But they're not accessible. They're not there in the way Pearl needs them to be. That experience of trying to reach someone you love through something that's absorbed them and finding you can't quite get through is one that I think a lot of people recognize from outside the specific context of gem fusion. People change, people merge with other things, other roles, other relationships, other habits, and sometimes you find yourself talking to a version of someone that used to be the person you knew, and now is something harder to reach. The show puts that experience in a children's cartoon using a giant purple alien. It works anyway. That's how good the metaphor is when it's extended consistently. Right. Now we get to Sardonyx, who is in many ways Sugalite's opposite. Sardonyx is probably the most aesthetically polished fusion in the show. I say this as someone who has a lot of affection for the others, but Sardonyx is genuinely something special to look at. She's tall and elegant, with a reddish-pink complexion and 4 arms and 2 sets of eyes stacked vertically. And she wears a top hat and a tailored suit and walks with this kind of theatrical confidence that makes every scene she's in feel like a performance. She's self-aware in a way the other fusions usually aren't. She knows she's charming, she enjoys it. Her voice, in the original production, was done by Alexia Kadim, and the casting adds something important. Sardonyx has the cadence of a stage magician or a variety show host. She presents herself always. She's aware of being watched. And there's something in that quality, the performance of it, that turns out to be very relevant to how she comes to exist in the first place. Sardonyx is Garnet and Pearl fused, and the show spends a good while in season 2 making you love her before revealing the circumstances in which she keeps being called into existence. The setup. There's a communications tower near Beach City that's supposed to be decommissioned, but it keeps getting repaired and reactivated. Someone is using it. The crystal gems suspect a homeworld presence. When the tower goes live again, Garnet and Pearl fuse into Sardonyx to take it down, and it works beautifully. Sardonyx dismantles the tower with this combination of Garnet's strategic precision and Pearl's balletic control, and it's a lovely sequence, and everyone is pleased. Then it happens again. The tower reactivates. Sardonyx takes it down again, then again. The penny drops for the viewer and then for the characters in the episode called Cry for Help. Pearl has been secretly repairing the tower herself. There's no homeworld presence. There's nothing happening. She's been engineering situations that require Sardonyx to exist, because she wants to keep being Sardonyx, and she can't think of any other way to make that happen. Pearl loves being Sardonyx. That's the core of it. When Pearl fuses with Garnet, she becomes something she doesn't feel like on her own. More capable, more impressive, more complete. She looks up to Garnet enormously, in a way that's complicated and probably not entirely healthy even before this incident. Garnet is in Pearl's eyes close to perfect, this vision of what fusion can be at its best. And being Sardonyx means, for a moment, being part of that, being worthy of it. The show is careful not to make Pearl villainous here. She's not manipulating Garnet for power or out of malice. She's lonely and she's addicted to a feeling, and she made very bad choices about how to get it. That's a human failing. It's recognizable. It's still wrong. Garnet's response is what makes this arc really worth thinking about. Garnet doesn't just get angry, she gets devastated in a way that feels qualitatively different from ordinary betrayal. When she finds out what Pearl has done, she briefly unfuses. Ruby and Sapphire separate from each other, which almost never happens. Garnet's body, the body she's inhabited for thousands of years, breaks apart under the weight of what she's just learned. She has to reconstitute herself. She has to actively choose to be Garnet again. That detail tells you everything about the stakes. For Garnet, fusion is not a tactic or a convenience, or even just an expression of love, though it is all of those things. It is her. It's the form her existence takes. To have that used, to have someone deceive her in order to fuse with her without her genuine consent, is a kind of violation that cuts to the absolute center of who she is. The parallel to real-world consent is one the show is drawing quite deliberately. Garnet says, at some point in this arc, that fusion isn't something you use. It's not a means to an end. And the fact that Pearl's motivations were sympathetic doesn't change the fact that what she did was take something that Garnet had offered freely and obtain more of it through deception. The consent Garnet gave was given based on false information, and the show treats that seriously. There's also a layer here that connects to Pearl's relationship with Rose Quartz, which we'll spend more time on later. Pearl has a long history of devotion to a figure who didn't always fully reciprocate in kind, of organizing herself around someone else's gravitational pull. Garnet, in Pearl's eyes, has some of that quality. She's luminous, she's certain, She's this embodiment of everything the show says fusion should be, and Pearl is drawn to her in a way that becomes obsessive. This is, among other things, the show being honest about the fact that admiration can become something that needs watching. Pearl admires Garnet. Pearl wants to be close to Garnet. Pearl wants to be valued by Garnet. Those are all reasonable feelings. Where it goes wrong is the moment Pearl starts prioritizing her access to those feelings over Garnet's autonomy. The reconciliation in friendship is worth mentioning because the show does something specific there. When Garnet and Pearl need to fuse again to save Steven, Garnet makes a point of asking Pearl if she's ready. She checks in. She makes Pearl confirm her consent explicitly rather than assuming it's there. And the way Pearl responds with this combination of relief and gratitude and genuine apology suggests that she understands what the ask means. Garnet isn't checking whether Pearl is capable. She's re-establishing that when they fuse, it will be because they both chose it. That's a small moment, but it's one I keep coming back to, because it's the show modeling what repair looks like. Not the absence of fusion, not permanent rupture, but the reinstatement of something honest between them. After everything, they can still be Sardonyx, but only if they're both actually willing. Sardonyx herself is interesting in the light of all this because she doesn't know any of it happened. Or rather, she doesn't know the second time she was called into existence was built on a lie. She has Garnet and Pearl's combined memories up to the point of fusion, but she isn't told the backstory. There's this poignant quality to Sardonyx's oblivious charm, knowing what you know about why she keeps appearing. She's delightful and theatrical, and completely unaware that her existence was partly manufactured by someone's loneliness and bad judgment. Sardonyx's gem, incidentally, is a type of onyx with alternating layers of sard and white. It's associated in historical traditions with things like eloquence, confidence, and protection in marriage. The marriage one is interesting given the context of what fusion represents in this show. It is, again, a choice of stone that doesn't feel accidental. There's another layer to the Sardonyx arc that's easy to miss on first watch, because the show introduces it quietly and then doesn't spell it out. When Garnet finds out what Pearl has been doing, one of the things that upsets her is not just the deception, but the waste of it. Pearl was calling Sardonyx into existence for no purpose, just to feel the feeling. And Sardonyx is an entity. She's a being who gets to exist for a few minutes and then is gone. Garnet and Pearl are using her, or Pearl is using her, as a means to something else, which, given that Garnet's whole nature is built around the idea that fusion is not a means to an end, carries a particular sting. Sardonyx doesn't know any of this is happening, of course. She's delightful and theatrical and has no idea she keeps being summoned for reasons that aren't worth the summoning. There's something genuinely poignant about that, the obliviousness of it, the way Sardonyx gets to be cheerful and perform for a moment and then vanishes. And the whole mess is behind her. The show also does something clever with the timing of the revelation. By the time we find out what Pearl has been doing, we've seen enough of Sardonyx to genuinely like her. We've seen Pearl fuse with Garnet and produce this wonderful theatrical entity, and we've enjoyed it. And so the discovery that it was built on a lie lands harder than it might have if we hadn't formed an attachment to Sardonyx first. The show is using our own affection for the fusion to make the betrayal hurt more, which is slightly devious of it. Steven's reaction to the Sardonyx arc is worth thinking about too. He's upset, of course, but the specific shape of his upset is interesting. He's upset for Garnet, and he's upset with Pearl, but he also shows this particular kind of grief that comes from discovering that someone he trusted to be reliable has done something that undermines that reliability. Steven needs stability from the crystal gems. His whole childhood, such as it is built around them. The idea that Pearl, who projects competence and judgment and care, would do something like this is frightening in a specific way that isn't just about this incident. It's worth remembering that Steven is growing up. He's learning, over the course of the series, that the adults in his life aren't infallible. The crystal gems are remarkable people who have made and will continue to make serious mistakes. The Sardonyx arc is one of the moments where Stephen has to hold a more complex picture of someone he loves. Pearl did something wrong. Pearl is still Pearl, still someone Stephen loves and trusts. Both things are true at once. That's very much the emotional territory the show is working in throughout. There's a wider point the Sardonyx arc makes about the crystal gems as a group that I want to bring in before we move on, because it connects to how the show builds toward its most mature version of these characters. The crystal gems, by the time we meet them in the pilot episode, have been together for thousands of years. Pearl, Amethyst, and Garnet have lived together, fought together, grieved together, and raised Stephen together for the entire duration of his life. That's an enormous amount of shared history. And one of the things the show does across its run is quietly reveal that the history between them is not uniformly warm. There are things that haven't been addressed, tensions that have been managed rather than resolved, old wounds that got covered over rather than healed. Sardonyx is one of those wounds coming to the surface. Pearl's manipulation of Garnet is not something that appeared out of nowhere. It's built from Pearl's specific insecurities and from the dynamic that's always existed between them, which involves Pearl needing Garnet's approval and Garnet being somewhat opaque and hard to read and not always available to give it. The show isn't entirely on Garnet's side here, in the sense that Garnet's guardedness, her inscrutability, has created some of the conditions in which Pearl's desperation grew. That's not a justification for what Pearl did, but it's a context. What the Sardonyx arc forces is a conversation the crystal gems needed to have and hadn't had. Garnet is hurt and Pearl is ashamed, and they have to actually talk about it, which they do in fragments across Cry for Help and Friendship. The conversations aren't particularly long or emotionally explicit. This is Garnet and Pearl we're talking about. Neither of them is prone to extended emotional processing, but they happen. And after they happen, something is different between them. The show often works this way. The big emotional confrontations are handled in relatively few words, not because the show is avoiding them, but because the characters are the kind of people who deal with things practically rather than elaborately. A few sentences from Garnet. Pearl's face doing the rest. Then they move forward. What I find meaningful about the Sardonyx arc, in retrospect, is that it's the show being honest that the crystal gems are not a perfectly functional family unit. They love each other, and they've managed to hold together for a very long time, and they've done remarkable things, and they also have real dysfunctions that needed addressing. And those dysfunctions were addressable, given honesty and time. That's the version of hope the show's most interested in. Not that things are fine, that things can get better, right? Now we get to the one that's been sitting at the back of the room this whole time. Let's start with Lapis, because Malachite doesn't make sense without her backstory, and her backstory is genuinely grim. Lapis Lazuli was a homeworld gem who came to Earth during the colonization period, before the war started. At some point she was caught up in the fighting and was poofed, which means her physical body was destroyed and she retreated into her gem to regenerate. This happens to gems, it's not permanent, they come back. Except that Lapis didn't come back, because a crystal gem found her gem and, in the chaos of war, mistook it for a homeworld spy's gem and trapped it in a mirror, a literal hand mirror, with the assumption that the gem inside was some kind of communication or recording device, not a person. Lapis was conscious the entire time. She was aware. She could see out of the mirror, and she could form images to try to communicate with whoever was holding her. But she couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She couldn't do anything except watch, and nobody realized there was anyone in there. The war ended. The crystal gems who might have known the context were corrupted in the final event of the war. Lapis sat in the mirror for thousands of years. Thousands. She ends up in a storage room in the crystal gems house, and she's there when Stephen finds her. And he's the first person who looks at the mirror and asks it a question instead of making a statement. He sees her moving the images around to form answers, and he immediately understands that there's someone in there. He releases her. She is not particularly grateful, which is completely fair. She just wants to go home. By the time Malachite forms, Lapis has been liberated, has had a deeply fraught encounter with the crystal gems, has tried to drain the ocean to summon a portal home, and been stopped by Steven, and has finally left Earth on a homeworld ship that's been summoned by Garnet's Ruby communicator. She has a complicated relationship with Steven that involves both genuine connection and enormous wariness. She's not a villain, but she's not an ally. She's someone who has been through something terrible and is trying to figure out how to exist now. And then Jasper shows up on the ship. Jasper is a quartz soldier, one of the finest warriors Homeworld ever produced, and she has nothing but contempt for fusion. Her view is essentially that fusion is what weak gems do to compensate for being inadequate on their own. Real strength, in Jasper's worldview, means being enough by yourself. She's spent her entire career being more than enough by herself. She's proud of this. Which makes what happens next particularly interesting. When the crystal gems destroy the homeworld ship and everybody ends up on the beach, Jasper is desperate and the crystal gems are about to capture her. She grabs Lapis's arm and she says, "I've seen what you can do. You've got power. Fuse with me." Lapis doesn't want to. That much is legible. She looks frightened and uncertain. Jasper's grip on her arm is not subtle. And then Lapis says yes, and they fuse, and Malachite appears. Malachite is colossal. She has a centaur-like structure with 6 arms, the lower 4 functioning as legs. She has 4 eyes and pointed teeth and wavy pale green hair. She looks like something that was put together by 2 people who couldn't agree on the design, which is exactly what she is. Her upper half leans toward Lapis's sleeker aesthetic, and her lower half leans toward Jasper's more aggressive one, and the join between them is uncomfortable in a way that's hard to look away from. She exists for approximately 30 seconds before Lapis springs the trap. The fusion wasn't agreement, it was strategy. Lapis had been thinking faster than Jasper realized. She knew that if she fused and then took control of the water, she could lock Malachite in chains and drag them both somewhere Jasper couldn't hurt anyone. She chose to sacrifice her own freedom in exchange for restraining Jasper. The crystal gems can't stop Malachite if Jasper's in control, but Lapis isn't planning to let Jasper be in control. And so Malachite is chained in her own water, dragged to the bottom of the ocean, and left there. The crystal gems watch it happen, and there's nothing they can do except recognize what Lapis has done and know that she knew what she was choosing. Garnet's assessment, which she gives to the others after, the fusion is based on anger and mistrust. It's inherently unstable. Lapis is holding it together through sheer will. She cannot keep that up forever. What follows is something the show handles in a way I find genuinely striking for a children's cartoon. We don't see Malachite again for several episodes, but in an episode called Chile Tid, Steven keeps falling asleep on the couch, and when he does, he accidentally enters a dream space. The dream keeps shifting, and eventually he finds himself somewhere that isn't quite his usual dream landscape. It's dark and watery and tinged green. And he finds Lapis there, exhausted, standing in this half-conscious interior space, while chains made of water extend from her in every direction, holding something down. She looks terrible. Not in a melodramatic way. In the way that someone looks when they've been doing something enormously taxing for a very long time with no rest and no relief. She tells Steven she's fine. She's clearly not fine. She tells him she can hold on. He's not sure she can. The detail that Lapis's hydrokinesis is powerful enough to restrain a fusion like Malachite, but just barely, and that maintaining that restraint requires her to be effectively imprisoned herself, is one of the more quietly devastating things the show does. She's not suffering for nothing. She made the choice deliberately. That doesn't make it less bad to sit with. There's also the shift that starts happening over the months. Malachite begins developing more of her own personality the way Sugalite did, but darker. The fusion itself starts to feel like a third presence in the shared mindscape. Not just Lapis and Jasper, but something growing in the space between them. Near the end of the period of imprisonment, Lapis loses control of the fusion to Jasper temporarily, and when Jasper has control, she insists on fighting Alexandrite, who the crystal gems have sent to deal with the situation, just because she wants to. There's no strategy in it. Jasper just wants to fight something. And then there's this line. In a moment, when the fusion identity is asserting itself, Lapis says, I am Malachite now. Not, I am Lapis trapped in Malachite. Not, we are Malachite. I am. The fusion's identity has started to overwrite Lapis's. The same thing that happened with Sugalite, the same dissolution of individual identity into the fusion, is beginning to happen here. Except in this case, the fusion is made of months of suffering and rage and coerced compliance, so what's growing in that space is not something you'd want taking over. The battle in Super Watermelon Island is when Malachite is finally defused. It takes a combination of the Watermelon Stevens and a full fight with Alexandrite before it happens. When Lapis and Jasper finally split, both of them are wrecked. Lapis flies away immediately. Jasper lands heavily and lies on the ground for a moment before getting up. They don't speak. The aftermath is where the show gets really complicated. Jasper, freed from the fusion, becomes obsessed with it. She wants to feel what she felt as Malachite again. She starts seeking out corrupted gems who have lost their minds to a kind of chaotic degradation, and fusing with them, trying to get back to that power level through whatever means available. Every fusion she forms is unstable and strange and doesn't give her what she's looking for. She is described as practically begging gems to fuse with her. And then, at the end of her arc in Season 3, she fuses with a corrupted gem on purpose, knowing what will happen. She allows the corruption to transfer to her. And she corrupts. The most powerful quartz homeworld ever produced, a gem who built her entire identity on the idea that she didn't need anyone else, destroys herself pursuing a fusion. There's an elegiac quality to Jasper's ending that the show earns. She was wrong about almost everything, certainly about fusion, but the show never pretends that her wrongness was simple. She was shaped by a society that told her she was great precisely as long as she didn't need anyone, and then she fell into something that showed her what it felt like to be part of something bigger, and she couldn't integrate that experience in any healthy way, because she had no framework for it, because Homeworld had made sure she didn't. Lapis's story is equally complicated from a different angle. In the episode Alone at Sea, several episodes after the diffusion, Stephen and Greg take Lapis out on a boat to try to help her feel better. And Jasper shows up. She wants to fuse again, and Lapis tells her no, and eventually Stephen has to make Jasper leave. But after Jasper's gone, Lapis tells Stephen something. She admits that she misses it. Not Jasper, exactly. Not the ocean floor, obviously, but something about being Malachite. Because in that fusion, she had control. She could feel how strong she was. She had taken the one who'd hurt her and made her a prisoner instead. All of the helplessness of her existence, the mirror, the thousands of years of captivity, she had inverted it. She had been the one holding the chains. And she liked that feeling, even though the thing she was controlling with those chains was herself as much as anyone else. And she tells Stephen, I was terrible in that fusion. I was awful. I was so angry. Like she's confessing something she's ashamed of, but the shame doesn't cancel out the part where she misses it. That moment is, I think, the most honest thing the show does about the psychology of a toxic relationship. Both parties carry something out of it that they wish they didn't. The fact that you know something was bad doesn't automatically resolve the feelings you developed during it. Lapis was genuinely terrible in that fusion. She used the power Malachite gave her to take out all of her accumulated rage on Jasper, and it felt good. And she hates that it felt good, and she misses it anyway. That's not a simple thing to put into a cartoon. The show doesn't resolve it neatly either. Lapis gets a redemption arc of sorts later, and she finds something that functions like peace, but the show doesn't pretend that the Malachite chapter just got tidied away. A note on Malachite the Stone: since I mentioned the show tends to be thoughtful with these. Malachite is a green copper carbonate mineral, quite beautiful, with distinctive concentric banding in varying shades of green. It's historically associated with protection and warding against danger, specifically the kind of danger that comes from outside. But malachite is also toxic when submerged in water. It releases compounds that are harmful. You're not supposed to put it in water. The gem that means protection is the one that becomes dangerous when it goes into the ocean. I don't know if that's intentional. It might be. It feels intentional. There's a dimension of the Malachite story that I've been sitting with for a while and want to think through here. What Lapis did, the decision she made on the beach, is an act of enormous self-sacrifice. She gave up her freedom to stop someone dangerous. She took years of abuse, in the form of Jasper dominating and fighting the fusion, in exchange for ensuring Jasper couldn't hurt anyone else. From the outside, that looks heroic. But the show gently complicates the heroism, because Lapis also chose the ocean floor partly because it was familiar. She was imprisoned before, in the mirror. She knows how to exist in captivity. She has some strange, warped expertise in it. And the question of whether the choice to go back to captivity, even as the one holding the chains, reflects something like health or something like deep trauma, is one the show leaves open. Garnet's comment, that the fusion is based on anger and mistrust, is interesting in this context. Anger and mistrust are what Lapis brought to it as much as Jasper did. Lapis is angry. She has every reason to be. But the anger doesn't make the fusion less dangerous for her. It might make it more dangerous because anger is sustaining. You can hold yourself together on anger for a long time. The question is what you're left with when it finally exhausts. The months of the fusion, which the show compresses and gestures at rather than depicting directly, must have been extraordinary in terms of what they did to Lapis. She held a monstrous fusion captive at the bottom of the ocean for most of a year using nothing but her own will and her own power. That's an almost superhuman feat, and she came out of it changed clearly in ways the show takes its time unpacking. Lapis in the third season, post-Malachite, is different from Lapis in the first season finale. She's harder in some ways and more fragile in others. She goes to live in the barn with Peridot, which becomes one of the show's more touching relationship arcs, precisely because it's so low stakes. It's two gems who don't quite fit anywhere, building something modest and domestic and genuine in a barn in the middle of nowhere. Lapis gets to be small for a while. She gets to not be a fusion and not be a prisoner and not be responsible for holding anything together. The show doesn't make a big deal out of how much that must mean to her. It just shows it. Jasper's ending, meanwhile, is one of the more genuinely tragic in the show's run. She's a character who was designed to be an antagonist, and she functions effectively in that role throughout seasons 1 through 3. But the show is careful to give her enough interiority that her final moments land with weight rather than satisfaction. She wanted something she couldn't name and couldn't have healthily. She pursued it through every available means. She destroyed herself doing it. And then years later, Yellow Diamond says she'll try to restore the corrupted gems. And Jasper is technically among those who might one day be healed. And the show leaves that there without fanfare. One small thing I want to mention. The real-world malachite stone I referenced earlier, the green copper mineral, has another quality beyond the toxicity in water. Malachite is known for being extremely soft for a stone, a 3.5 to 4 on the Mohs hardness scale. It scratches easily. It's beautiful, but fragile. You're supposed to handle it carefully. Given that the fusion named for it is this colossal, apparently unbreakable thing that keeps the entire ocean in check for months, the softness of the actual stone underneath all of that feels like it says something. Something about both of them. I don't know, it might be a coincidence. But this show doesn't do many things by accident. There's one more thread I want to follow in the Malachite story, which is what it tells us about Homeworld's view of Lapis specifically. Lapis was not a crystal gem. She wasn't a rebel. She was a Homeworld gem who came to Earth before the war, got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and was imprisoned in a mirror by a crystal gem who made a mistake. She's not even a casualty of the war in the usual sense. She's a casualty of confusion, of one gem looking at another gem and making an incorrect assumption and never correcting it. When she's finally freed in Season 1, she goes home to Homeworld. And Homeworld imprisons her again, this time for talking to Steven and potentially sharing information. She escapes and makes it back to Earth, and then the Homeworld ship arrives and Jasper grabs her arm and says, "Fuse with me." So Lapis's relationship with imprisonment by the time Malachite forms is not a new thing. It's the defining pattern of her existence. She was imprisoned in the mirror. She was imprisoned by Homeworld. She chose to imprison herself and Jasper at the bottom of the ocean. And then later, she and Paradise build a life in a barn that she describes, eventually, as feeling more like home than anywhere. She's basically choosing a very small defined space again, but this time it's hers. The progression of Lapis's relationship with confinement across the series, from the mirror to the ocean to the barn to eventually being able to go wherever she wants, is one of the show's quieter character arcs and one I find quite moving. She started with no control at all, spent years imprisoned against her will, then imprisoned herself as an act of desperate agency, then gradually learned to inhabit a space she chose without it feeling like a cell. That's not a straightforward arc. There's no episode where it clicks into place. It's just a slow movement across several seasons from someone for whom space and freedom were pure trauma to someone who can sit outside a barn and watch the stars and feel okay. And Malachite is the hinge point of that arc. The choice she made on the beach, as terrible as it was the first time in her long history that Lapis had real power over her own situation. It didn't lead anywhere good immediately, but it was hers. I think about the Lapis and Jasper relationship a lot, actually, in terms of what the show is saying about who has power over whom and how that shifts. Jasper had all the institutional power. She was a decorated soldier. Lapis was nobody, a gem who'd been in a mirror for millennia. And then they fused, and Lapis had more power than Jasper had ever been threatened by in her life. And what Lapis did with that power was complicated and not entirely admirable and ultimately self-destructive. And the show doesn't simplify it in either direction. It just watches. That's quite a thing for a show about a kid who lives on a beach and fights monsters. I want to close the Malachite section by coming back to something Garnet says when she first assesses the fusion, that observation about anger and mistrust being the foundation. It's stated very briefly and the show moves on, but it carries a lot. The interesting thing about anger and mistrust as a foundation for a fusion is that they're both relational. You can't be angry in a vacuum. You can't mistrust nothing. Anger and mistrust require an object, require another being, require connection of a kind. They're not warmth, obviously. They're not what Garnet and Sapphire have, but they're a form of relationship. A dark one, but one that exists between two specific beings and not just as an abstraction. What that means is that Malachite is, in some sense, a genuine fusion in the way the cluster prototypes are not. The cluster gems aren't built on a relationship. They're built on proximity and pressure and compulsion with no interpersonal element at all. Malachite is built on something. It's just something bad. That distinction is part of why Malachite can develop her own identity in a way the cluster gems can't. There's enough of a relational foundation to produce an entity. She's real in a way that the forced fusions are only partial, and that makes her both more coherent and in some ways more dangerous. She's a being who exists and has wants, and those wants are the product of the worst parts of two people in conflict. The show doesn't have Malachite return after Super Watermelon Island, which I think is the right choice for the same reason it was right not to return to Sugalite as a plot point. She's a chapter that needed to close. Some fusions are resolved by the people who formed them, developing enough to make a different choice. Lapis and Jasper's separate arcs after Malachite are about exactly that, the slow, painful work of becoming someone who doesn't need to go back to that. Right, so, the Gem War, the broad context for anyone who needs it. Thousands of years ago, the Diamond Authority decided Earth was going to be a gem colony. Gem colonies work by incubating new gems in the planet's crust, which consumes the organic life of the planet and eventually makes it uninhabitable. Pink Diamond was given Earth as her first colony. Rose Quartz led a rebellion to stop the colonization. The war lasted a long time. Gems on both sides were shattered, and eventually it ended with something called the corrupting light, which was a massive emission of energy from the diamonds that corrupted almost every gem on Earth's surface, turning them into monsters. Rose and the crystal gems were shielded by Rose's power. Almost everyone else was not. What happened to the shattered gems is the part we're looking at now. Gems are, at their core, their gemstone. The physical body they project is a form of hard light, a projection. The gem itself is the actual being. When a gem is shattered, that gem breaks into pieces, and each piece is still partially conscious, still trying to regenerate, still reaching for the form of the body it's supposed to have, but incomplete, fractured, unable to become whole on its own. Pearl explains this to Stephen early in the show, in a context that's being kept deliberately vague at the time. She says that gem shards have a powerful partial consciousness, and that they've been used throughout history to create semi-sentient drone soldiers. The homeworld military would take shards, put them in something, and the partial consciousness would animate it. That's deeply unpleasant on its own. But what homeworld did with the shards of the crystal gems who were shattered in the war was something else. They forced them to fuse. The process isn't described in full detail, which I suspect was a deliberate choice. We know it involves burying the shards together and applying pressure, essentially forcing gemstones that have no ability to consent or resist to merge with each other. The result is a new gemstone, a forced one, that projects a physical form. But because the shards aren't whole, because they're fragments of multiple different beings, the forms they project are not coherent bodies. They're assemblages of mismatched parts. An arm connected to another arm at an angle. Hands sprouting from wrong locations. Legs arranged in configurations that don't correspond to any natural body plan. They look like something designed by someone who had been told what a body is but had never seen one. They're called cluster gems or gem mutants. The show uses both. Garnet encounters them for the first time in the episode Keeping It Together. She and Stephen have gone to the prime kindergarten, which is where gems were grown, to investigate something. And they find the first cluster gems there, still in their containers in the control room, some of them having escaped and wandered the facility. And the reaction the show gives Garnet is the most significant thing about the sequence. Garnet almost diffuses. Ruby and Sapphire start to separate from each other. Garnet has to actively hold herself together. She's not frightened, exactly, or not only frightened, she's horrified. Specifically, viscerally, personally horrified. Stephen asks her what's wrong, and she tells him very quietly that these are crystal gems, that the shards they're made of are the shards of gems who fought for the rebellion, who died for Earth, and that Homeworld took their remains and did this to them, as a punishment, or an experiment, or both. Garnet's response to this makes complete sense given everything we've established about what fusion means to her. This is the worst violation of fusion she can imagine. Not a bad fusion like Malachite, not a deceptive one like Sardonyx, not an obsessive one like Sugalite. It's gems who can't consent because they're fragments, forced together by external pressure into shapes that are painful and wrong, that still reach for completion because that's the residual instinct of a conscious being who knows it's incomplete and that will never find it. There's a leitmotif for the cluster gems in the show's score. It sounds like separate instruments and separate musical ideas being forced together, all wrong, fighting against each other, not resolving into anything. Not unlike the creatures themselves. It's one of the more clever pieces of sound design the show does. The detail that's almost worse than the monster bodies. These things still regenerate. The shards are still trying to produce a body. The body keeps being wrong, and the regeneration process causes them obvious pain. You can see it. They don't know why they hurt. They don't know where they are or who they are. The only goal they have is the residual instinct of the shards. Find the missing pieces. Become whole. The tragedy is that they never can, because the pieces they're looking for weren't theirs to begin with. They were taken from multiple different beings and forced together, so there's no whole available to them. A few of them escaped the kindergarten and made their way into the surrounding area and eventually into human-occupied spaces. The episode Nightmare Hospital has 2 of them mistaken for car accident victims and admitted to a hospital, which is where Stephen and Connie run into them. This is partly a horror episode played relatively straight. which was not something the show's early seasons were doing very often. The creatures are threatening without being evil. They're dangerous in the way that something in severe, uncomprehending distress is dangerous. Now, all of that, everything we've just covered, was the prototype phase. Peridot, a homeworld gem who arrives on Earth in Season 2 ostensibly to check on the colony's status, eventually reveals what the experiments were building toward. She describes it in an episode called When It Rains, while sheltering in the barn from a storm, talking to Steven with the matter-of-fact attachment of someone who has only ever related to this information as technical data. She says there's something buried in the Earth's mantle called the cluster. And she says that if it forms, it will be larger than the Earth. The cluster is millions of gem shards, fused together into a geo-weapon, not prototypes, not experiments, not the finished thing. Homeworld, having decided Earth was no longer viable as a colony, having decided to give up on it, buried a planet killer inside it, made of the shattered remains of crystal gems. If the cluster reaches full size and emerges, it will destroy the Earth from the inside out. The show lets this land. It doesn't immediately rush to the solution. There's a conversation between Peridot and Steven where the implications sit for a moment. Peridot, who has until this point been an antagonist, is clearly uncomfortable explaining this. Not because she feels guilty, not yet, but because even she can see that the look on Steven's face is doing something to her. He asks what happens to the gems in the cluster. She says there's no way to help them. They're millions of shards with no memory of who they were, fused without any awareness, just this one shared drive. Grow, take form, emerge. What she doesn't say, and what Steven is clearly thinking, those are people in there. The plan the crystal gems come up with involves Steven and Peridot drilling down to the Earth's core. They build a drill. They go down together through the geology of the planet, encountering cluster gem fragments along the way that attack them with the blind instinct of creatures seeking to become whole. And eventually they reach the cluster, which is already beginning to form. What Steven does next is not fight it. He can't fight millions of shards. He goes to sleep inside the drill pod and reaches out through his dream powers, his ability to enter the psychic space of other beings, and he makes contact. He finds awareness in there. Not clear awareness, not anything like communication in the usual sense, but something. The fragments know they're not whole. They know they're missing pieces. They're reaching for each other, not with malice, but with need. And Steven, in this very quiet, very unusual scene, helps them find each other in a different way. Helps them find enough awareness of the other fragments around them that they can choose, collectively, to bubble themselves, to hold themselves in stasis instead of emerging. To just sit, it works, for now. What the show does with the cluster after this is interesting in the context of the larger story. The cluster has now been given a degree of sentience and choice that it didn't have before, and the show doesn't forget about it. In a later season, when Yellow Diamond and Blue Diamond's ships are landing near Earth and creating seismic disruptions, the cluster stirs again and begins to partially form. And this time it forms enough to help. The cluster, the thing that was buried as a weapon to destroy the planet, helps protect the planet when it's given the chance. That's very Steven Universe. It insists on the possibility of recovery and repurposing in contexts where most stories wouldn't bother. Yellow Diamond, at the end of the series proper, vows to restore as many of the shards as she can. Whether that's adequate reparation for what she ordered done to them is a question the show doesn't entirely answer, which seems about right. Some things can't be made right. You just do what you can. There's a moment in Garnet's encounter with the cluster gems in Keeping It Together where she says something that stuck with me. She's holding herself together, barely, watching these broken things reach for pieces they'll never find. And she says that she's never forgiven herself for not being there at the end of the war. That if she had been there, maybe she could have done something. She probably couldn't have. There were thousands of shattered gems, but she carries it anyway, Ruby and Sapphire chose to fuse because they loved each other, two beings coming together willingly. And then their war produced this, the opposite extreme of that choice. Beings forced together against any possible consent, turned into weapons, left underground for thousands of years in the dark. There's something I want to dwell on a little longer, because I think it gets passed over fairly quickly in most discussions of this arc. The question of what the gems in the cluster prototypes were experiencing before Steven intervened. The show tells us they seek out other gems trying to find their missing pieces. The instinct of a broken thing trying to become whole. But trying to find their missing pieces assumes something about what the pieces can want. These are shards that have enough consciousness to reach, enough of something like instinct or drive to cause them to move and seek. They're not entirely nothing. They're not people in the full sense, but they're not entirely objects either. They exist in this horrible in-between space where they're aware enough to suffer and not aware enough to understand why. The episode Keeping It Together handles this carefully. The cluster gems don't read as monsters in the horror movie sense. They read as injuries, like wounds that can move. Garnet's reaction to them, that near diffusion, the horror she can barely contain, tells you everything about what she's registering. She's not seeing monsters. She's seeing crystal gems reduced to something that can only reach and can never arrive. And the fact that these were specifically crystal gems, gems who chose Earth, who chose the rebellion, who chose to stand for something, that their shattered remains were used for this particular experiment, feels like it was a deliberate choice by Homeworld. Not just punishment for the rebels, but desecration of what the rebels believed in. A statement that the choice they made meant nothing, that they could be broken apart and their pieces turned against themselves and against the planet they died to protect. Yellow Diamond ordered this. The show takes that seriously without turning Yellow Diamond into a purely two-dimensional villain, which is a difficult line to walk. Yellow Diamond is the one who ordered the cluster. She's also eventually the one who promises to try to undo it. The show is interested in how someone becomes capable of something like the cluster gems, and the answer it gives is a combination of grief, rigidity, and a society that trained her to see power as the only valid response to pain. That doesn't make it acceptable, but it makes it comprehensible. The show's handling of Yellow Diamond's arc is worth its own video, honestly. But for our purposes tonight, the significant thing is that she was able to order something like the cluster because the society she led had long since normalized treating gems as resources rather than people. The cluster gems are the logical extreme of that. You shatter gems in war because gems are resources that your enemy has deployed against you. Then you use the shards because resources shouldn't be wasted. Then you force them together because you're trying to produce a weapon and you have the raw material available. Every step follows from a premise that was in place long before the war started. Peridot's journey across seasons 2 and 3 is interesting in this context because she starts from exactly that position. She's a homeworld gem who genuinely doesn't understand, early on, why the crystal gems are upset about the cluster gems. She explains the cluster to them with the affect of someone reporting a technical matter. She's not being cruel, she just has never been trained to consider what the shards might have been, or what it cost them, or whether that matters. And then she spends time with Steven, and she changes. Not dramatically, not all at once, but she starts to see. The moment in When It Rains, where she and Steven are sheltering from a storm and she's explaining the cluster, and she starts to register his face changing as she talks, is a small, specific moment that the show earns because we've watched Peridot fail to register human emotional responses correctly so many times that when she finally does, when she finally stops and actually sees the effect of what she's saying, it means something. She doesn't fully understand what she's registering, but she notices. And noticing is where everything starts. The cluster itself, once Steven makes contact with it, becomes one of the show's more unusual sequences. It's not a fight. It's barely even a scene in the traditional sense. Steven goes to sleep inside the drill pod while Peridot keeps drilling. And he enters the dream space, and in the dream space he's surrounded by a cacophony of half-conscious voices, fragments, pieces of people who were shattered thousands of years ago in a war they were fighting because they believed in something. And he reaches out to them the same way he reaches out to everyone, by making them feel less alone, by helping them find each other. He can't give them back what they lost. He can't heal them. He can't make them whole in the way they're desperately reaching toward. But he can give them enough awareness of each other, enough presence with each other, that they can make a choice. And they do. They choose to hold still, to bubble themselves and wait, rather than emerge and destroy. That choice, made by millions of fragments of beings who have been conscious and suffering and reaching for thousands of years, is maybe the most quietly powerful thing in the show. Stephen doesn't save them. He gives them enough of themselves to save themselves. Something I keep thinking about in the context of the forced fusions is the question of scale. The show is remarkably good at making you hold the individual and the systemic at the same time. The individual cases, the cluster gems that escaped the kindergarten and wandered into the surrounding area and ended up in a hospital, that a 12-year-old and his friend had to fight because a system of atrocities had put them there, are small and specific and horrible. And then the cluster's millions. Millions. There's no way to meaningfully hold millions in your mind as individual beings. You can know intellectually that the cluster is made of individual fragments, each of which was once part of a person who had a name and a function and a place in the world. But you can't actually think about all of them at once. The cluster becomes, at the scale of millions, an abstraction. An environmental fact, almost. A bomb in the planet. The show is aware of this problem. That's why it has Stephen make individual contact with the cluster rather than, say, drilling in and destroying it from outside. The only way to treat the cluster ethically is to try to recover the individual awareness inside it, rather than dealing with it as a mass. Stephen can't do that for all of them at once, but he can make enough contact that they can find each other, and that seems to be enough. The solution requires treating what seems like an abstraction as a collection of persons. That's actually a fairly radical ethical proposition to put in a children's cartoon. The show is saying, the scale doesn't change the obligation. Millions of shards are still millions of people. You don't get to round down to zero just because the number is too large to picture. Peridot's arc from someone who relates to the cluster as a technical problem to someone who understands why it matters, why the shards are people and not just material, is the human scale version of that proposition. She's the one character who starts from the position the Diamond Authority instilled in every gem on Homeworld, which is that certain kinds of beings are resources, and she has to arrive, slowly and through specific experience, at the opposite position. The show makes that journey visible because it's the journey the audience needs to take too if they're going to understand why the cluster matters. The other thing worth sitting with is what the cluster gem's ongoing existence says about Homeworld's indifference. The prototypes were left in the kindergarten when Homeworld abandoned Earth. Nobody came back to check on them, or to end them, or to do anything with them. They were just left there in their containers, waiting. Thousands of years of being broken and aware and trapped in the dark. And then the containers opened and they emerged into a world they had no framework for, still reaching for pieces they'd never find. That specific kind of abandonment, the being left rather than being ended, is almost worse than the initial act. At least the initial act had a purpose, however monstrous. The abandonment was just carelessness. They didn't matter enough to deal with. Yellow Diamond's eventual promise to restore as many of the shards as possible is the show's attempt to address that carelessness, to say that the indifference wasn't the final word. Whether it's adequate reparation is a question that I think the show leaves genuinely open, not because it's avoiding the question, but because it's honest that there's no clean answer. You can't make right what was done to the cluster. You can do something. That's what's available. Let's come back up from the Earth's core and talk about something smaller scale. Topaz is introduced in the season 4 finale as Aquamarine's enforcer. If Aquamarine is the face of Homeworld's operation on Earth, the charming and utterly ruthless small gem who gives the orders, Topaz is the muscle. She's large and golden and largely silent. She does what she's told. There are actually two of them two topaz gems who are themselves fused into a single, larger topaz. The show doesn't make a big deal out of this initially, it's just a detail you might notice if you're paying attention, but it becomes relevant to understanding her whole situation. The mission they've been sent on is to collect humans for Pink Diamond's zoo. The zoo is exactly what it sounds like. A habitat in space where humans live in a perfectly controlled environment, under the impression that it's their normal life, unaware that they're on display. Pink Diamond established it a long time ago, apparently because she was fascinated by humans and wanted to preserve some of them. It's benevolent in intention and completely monstrous in practice. But that's kind of a recurring theme with Pink Diamond. Aquamarine has a list of humans to collect, apparently drawn from something Steven accidentally said during a message sent to Homeworld earlier in the season. She goes through the list with brisk efficiency, and Topaz handles the acquisition. What Topaz does to capture humans is fuse around them. She unfuses briefly, separates into the two Topaz components, and then the humans are placed between them, and they fuse back together with the humans encased inside. The humans are conscious. They're suspended in the fusion, unable to move or speak, held inside Topaz's form as passengers. It's used throughout the finale, and it is quietly one of the most disturbing things the show depicts because it's not played with horror music or dramatic lighting. It's just what Topaz does. It's her function. She was probably designed for this. The humans inside her can apparently feel things and hear things to a limited extent. We know this because in one of the key scenes of the finale, while Topaz is holding several captured humans, she walks past a conversation Steven is having with someone about the people being taken, about how much they love each other, about how frightened they are. And Topaz starts crying. Not loudly, just quietly. These large golden tears running down this enormous stoic face. Aquamarine notices and snaps at her to hold it together. Topaz does. But the moment is there. What that scene is doing is giving Topaz an inner life at the moment you'd least expect it. She's heard the humans inside her talking about their love for each other, their fear, their wishes, and something in that has moved her. Not enough to change what she does. Not in that moment. But enough that the camera notices. Enough that we're meant to notice. Enough that the show is asking you to hold two things at once. This is terrible. And the being doing it is not made of stone. There's a specific reading of Topaz's situation that's worth spending a moment on. She and her other half fuse to perform this function. Their fusion is not a choice made out of love or even comfort. It's their job. They are literally a tool built for a specific task, and that task is carrying people against their will. The fact that there are two of them, that they are themselves a fusion, means the show is asking, what does it mean to be a fusion whose purpose is exploitation? What does it mean to use the same act that defines Ruby and Sapphire's love as a mechanism for trapping people? Topaz doesn't resolve this in the episode. She doesn't rebel. She doesn't let the humans go. She cries, and then she keeps doing what she's supposed to do. Which is, in a strange way, more realistic than a clean redemption arc would be. She's embedded in a system that doesn't give her easy choices. Later, though, the show does come back to it. In I Am My Mom, when things escalate and Steven offers himself up in exchange for the captured humans, Topaz is given a moment of choice, and there's something in her response that suggests she's still carrying the earlier scene. She's aware in a way that Aquamarine isn't. And then in Steven Universe Future, the epilogue series, there's a small detail that I think is lovely. When Little Homeworld is being established on Earth, where gems from Homeworld are choosing to come and live in Era 3, two Topazes are there. Happy. Voluntarily fused. Not for a mission. Not to carry anyone. Just because they want to be. They're tending a garden, I think. It's genuinely sweet. The show doesn't draw a big line connecting those moments. It doesn't say, remember Topaz the Enforcer? Now look at her. It just lets the detail be there. The Topaz who cried inside a mission she was supposed to be stoned through is now living somewhere peaceful and choosing her fusion for herself. I find that one of the quieter, good things the show does. Not a triumphant redemption, not a drawn out arc, just a detail in the background of a happier world that says it was possible. They made it through. Whatever they were made to be, they got to become something else. The topazes are not the last fusion built from something uncomfortable that the show gives that gentleness to. But before we get to the most quietly sad case, there's one more that operates at the complete other end of that spectrum. Because where Topaz is a tool who finds her way to something better, Bluebird Azurite is a fusion that chose itself and chose wrong, and she's fascinating in a completely different way. While we're with Topaz, it's worth spending a moment on the 2 Topaz detail, because I think it says something interesting about Homeworld's attitude toward fusion that the show doesn't announce loudly. The Topazes are themselves a fusion of 2 Topaz gems. They're not just a big gem who happens to fuse with things. They exist as a fusion as their operational state. They were presumably fused before the mission, and they'll presumably fuse again after it. Their function requires them to use fusion as a mechanism for containing humans, which means they have to be capable of fusing in the first place, which means Homeworld needed them to be a cross-gem fusion, which means Homeworld bent its own rules about fusion when it was useful to do so. That's not surprising. The show makes fairly clear that Homeworld's prohibition on cross-gem fusion was always selectively applied. Same gem fusions for tactical purposes, fine. Different gem fusions for purposes that served the Diamond Authority, apparently also fine as long as nobody important was watching. It's the cross-gem fusions of love and choice that were considered scandalous. The difference isn't really about the fusion itself, it's about whether the fusion represents something uncontrolled, something that emerged from gems making their own choices rather than following orders. The Topazes fuse because they were told to. Garnet fuses because she and Sapphire fell in love. Homeworld can tolerate the first one and not the second. That tells you everything about what Homeworld was actually threatened by. There's also something I find a bit heartbreaking about the Topaz who cried in the context of what she was designed for. She was built to be an instrument of a system that used fusion to trap living beings. And the thing that breaks through her training, the thing that makes her cry, is hearing those living beings talk about love and fear and the people they care about. She was made to contain the thing she is moved by. The irony of that is very quiet in the show, but it sits there. The brief appearance of the Topazes in a little Homeworld in future is, as I said, genuinely sweet. But it's also slightly more than sweet if you think about it. They're gems who were used as tools for something terrible, who had their capacity for fusion weaponized, and who are now in a place where they can choose what fusion means for them. They chose to stay together, not for a mission, not because they were ordered to, just because they want to be, apparently. The show doesn't verify whether these are the exact same Topazes from the capture mission or other Topazes from Homeworld who happen to arrive in Era 3. It might be a different pair entirely, but it doesn't feel important to resolve that. What feels important is that the show puts Topazes in Little Homeworld doing well, and places that image after everything we saw them do, and lets the contrast exist quietly. The Topazes are not the last fusion built from something uncomfortable that the show gives that gentleness to. But before we get to the most quietly sad case, there's one more that operates at the complete other end of that spectrum. Because where Topaz is a tool who finds her way to something better, Bluebird Azurite is a fusion that chose itself and chose wrong, and she's fascinating in a completely different way. And just to round out this section properly, I want to mention one detail about Topaz's design that I find quite lovely in a functional way. She's golden and large and tends towards stillness. In the episodes where she appears as an antagonist, she says almost nothing. She's a physical presence and a threat, but not a personality. At least not an accessible one. The show is making it easy to read her as just an object, just a tool, just muscle. And then she cries. The choice to give Topaz the crying scene rather than a line of dialogue is smart. Topaz isn't a character who can express herself easily. She doesn't have Pearl's articulateness or even Lapis's raw expressiveness. She just has this one involuntary moment where something gets through her professionalism. The tears do the work that a speech couldn't do, because a speech would be out of character and would require Topaz to have found the words for something she's barely let herself feel. The tears are prior to words. They're the body registering something before the mind has processed it. That's a small specific piece of craft that I think gets overlooked because the episode moves quickly past it. But it's the hinge on which Topaz's entire arc turns. Since we're in the vicinity of thinking about homeworld gems who were used as instruments and then found their way out of that, the Topazes are part of a broader pattern in the show that turns up repeatedly. A lot of the gems who start as antagonists are ultimately revealed to be gems who were doing what their society shaped them to do, who had never been given the option to imagine themselves differently, and who, when given that option, often take it. Peridot is the most prominent example of this arc, but the Topazes are a quieter version. They were made for a purpose. The purpose was bad. They got to put it down eventually. The show returns to this idea enough that it becomes clear it's a deliberate theme. Homeworld produced a lot of instruments. What happens when the instruments get to choose is one of the questions the show is most consistently interested in. Bluebird Azurite shows up in Steven Universe Future, which is the epilogue series set after the main show's resolution. By this point, the diamonds have been dealt with. The crystal gems are living peacefully in Beach City. Little homeworld is being built, and Steven is in the process of having a prolonged emotional breakdown that the series is tactfully treating as a coming-of-age story. 2 gems from the original series, Aquamarine and Eyeball Ruby, have had their careers effectively ruined as indirect consequences of Steven's actions. Aquamarine's mission to collect humans failed. Eyeball Ruby had a whole thing where she was ejected into space. They've apparently spent the intervening time finding each other and bonding over as a shared grudge. And that bonding was apparently strong enough that they learned how to fuse. The result is Bluebird. She is, I want to stress this, tiny. Bluebird is the shortest fusion in the entire franchise. She barely comes up to Steven's shoulder. She has a single eye, a navy blue complexion with red and mint patches, a bowl cut, and 6 limbs, 2 arms and 4 legs, which gives her this oddly insectal quality when she moves. She's wearing a small suit with a white collar and a blue tie. She looks, initially, like nothing so much as a very formal toddler. She arrives at the little homeworld construction site acting warm and delightful. She brings food. She jokes around. She integrates herself into the group with the practiced ease of someone who has been planning this. Steven, who has been established throughout Future as someone who is currently very bad at recognizing threats because he's emotionally overwhelmed and trying to stay positive, is charmed by her. Garnet is not. Garnet clocks her immediately, and Garnet is right, obviously. Bluebird is there to hurt Steven, not through direct combat, at least not initially. She's trying to undermine him psychologically, to shake his sense of security in a little homeworld, to cause him harm in ways that will be difficult to point to. She is doing this because she and the 2 gems she's made of have decided that their grievances are Steven's fault, and they'd like him to suffer for it. There's something fascinating about Bluebird as a concept in the context of this show, because she's the proof of concept for a proposition the show has been implying throughout. You can fuse out of anything. You can fuse out of a shared obsession. You can fuse out of a mutual project. You can fuse out of hatred. It doesn't require love. It doesn't even require liking each other. It just requires 2 beings who are oriented in the same direction with enough alignment and their energy to make the fusion possible. Bluebird is, in that sense, a fun house mirror of Garnet, where Garnet is 2 gems whose love created a stable, warm, centered being. Bluebird is 2 gems whose shared resentment created this small, volatile, outwardly cheerful thing with a mean streak running through it. The affectation of niceness, the bowl cut and the tie, and the food she brings is almost a parody of the hospitality the crystal gems try to embody. She's performing friendliness as cover. The show does something interesting with the deception element. Bluebird's warmth is fake, but the fact that she can project it, that Aquamarine and Eyeball can produce something that reads as charming, is worth noticing. Aquamarine is described in show by Steven as awful, small, and mean. Eyeball is gruff and hostile. Together, as Bluebird, they can access something neither of them quite managed separately. the fusion is still built on something rotten. But the show suggests that the blend of two personalities can produce traits that neither of them was expressing alone, even in a fusion as dark as this one. The detail that lingers most, for me, is that Bluebird is never redeemed. The show redeems a lot of people. Yellow Diamond, Blue Diamond, Peridot, Lapis, Bismuth, the Topazes. The show has a very strong redemptive instinct. Bluebird is the exception. She's defeated, she leaves, and she's still out there somewhere, and the show doesn't tie a bow on it. She and her components just continue existing, presumably still angry. That's more honest than a clean resolution would be. Not every difficult relationship ends with healing. Some things just persist. Some fusions of resentment just keep being. The show, which normally reaches for hope wherever it can find it, leaves this one open. And I think that's the right call. It would feel false to redeem Bluebird in the same way it would feel false to pretend that some resentments don't just outlast the circumstances that produce them. A small note on the gemstone: Bluebird azurite is a real mineral. It's a deep blue copper carbonate hydroxide mineral, often found growing alongside malachite, which connects it to the show's other notable copper mineral fusion. Azurite is associated in various traditions with insight and clarity and the ability to see through illusion. The fact that the fusion built on illusion and deception is named after a stone of clarity is either ironic or pointed or both. Also, in the real world, Bluebird azurite containing malachite is a recognized mineral combination called azure malachite. The show essentially named a fusion of hatred and deception after a mineral that forms by growing alongside the stone it named its most infamous toxic fusion after. I have no idea if the crew were thinking about this when they made the choice, but it's there. What I find most interesting about Bluebird as an episode of Steven Universe Future is what it says about where Steven is psychologically during that series. He's post-resolution, nominally. The diamonds are no longer a threat. The corruption has been lifted from the gems, everything is supposed to be fine now. And Steven, who built his entire identity around being the one who fixed things, around having the solution and the goodwill and the healing power, is discovering that being post-resolution is not the same as being healed. He wants Bluebird to be real. He wants her to be a new gem who chose peace and came to Little Homeworld in good faith. He wants this so badly that he misses the signs that she's not, or at least pushes them aside. Garnet doesn't miss them. Steven is a little bit annoyed with Garnet for not missing them, which is a specific dynamic the show does well in Future. Steven wanting the people he trusts to validate his optimism and being quietly frustrated when they don't. The show is tracking throughout Future the ways Steven's habit of assuming the best in everyone has served him and the ways it has cost him. It served him enormously with Peridot, with Lapis, with the diamonds, with basically everyone who did eventually become an ally. It doesn't serve him with Bluebird. Some things are what they look like on the surface, which is to say bad. Some resentments aren't looking for healing. And part of what Future is doing is helping Steven learn the difference, which is a harder lesson than any of the ones the original series was teaching. The scene where Bluebird is finally revealed, where her friendly performance drops and she's simply hostile, is interesting because Steven doesn't seem shocked. He seems tired. Like he knew on some level and was hoping to be wrong. That particular emotional texture, the exhaustion of having hoped for something and having it not happen, is something Future is very good at. There's also a fun technical detail about Bluebird's design that I like. She has 4 legs, which is unusual for a fusion. Malachite also, effectively, has 4 legs, though the show characterizes hers differently. Bluebird is the second non-corrupted fusion in the franchise with extra legs, and the fact that she shares that trait with the most infamous toxic fusion in the series seems unlikely to be entirely coincidental. Even the design is doing commentary. There's a version of the Bluebird episode that would have been less interesting, where she shows up, is immediately identified as a threat, gets defeated quickly, and leaves. The show doesn't do that version. Instead, it lets the deception run for a while. It lets Steven enjoy her company. It lets the audience see what it feels like when something seems genuinely warm and turns out not to be, which is a different and more unsettling experience than a threat that's clearly marked from the start. The fact that Bluebird is convincing that she can produce an impression of friendliness that most people can't see through says something about what the fusion is doing for Aquamarine and Eyeball beyond just making them physically more powerful. Together, as Bluebird, they can access something they probably couldn't separately. Aquamarine alone is described as awful, ruthless, and mean. Eyeball alone is gruff and hostile. Together, they can be charming. The blend of personalities is producing a surface that neither of them has individually. That's actually not uninteresting as an observation about what fusion does, even in a dark context. Even a fusion built on resentment produces something new. The new thing happens to be a vehicle for revenge rather than a vehicle for love. But the mechanism is the same. Two beings who are oriented in the same direction, sufficiently aligned in their energy, producing something that neither of them is alone. The show uses that to underline the point that fusion is a tool and what matters is the intention and the relationship behind it. Bluebird and Garnet use the same mechanism. The difference is everything that the mechanism is built on. Right? Last one. And this one is different from everything we've covered because it's not about a villain and it's not about a catastrophe. It's about something much quieter and maybe more uncomfortable for that. Rainbow Quartz doesn't look like a dark fusion. On first watch, she barely registers as significant at all. She appears in a flashback in the episode We Need to Talk for maybe 2 minutes. She doesn't say anything, and the episode moves on. It's only once you know the full context of Pearl and Rose's relationship that the scene becomes difficult to look at. Let me set this up properly. Pearl is, as most people who've watched the show know, deeply in love with Rose Quartz. She has been for thousands of years. The show makes this clear quite early and then spends its entire run complicating what that means and what it cost Pearl to carry it. What the show eventually reveals in its later seasons is the full context of what Pearl was before the crystal gems. Pearl was a Pearl capital P, a type of gem designed to serve a specific owner. Pearls in homeworld society are essentially status symbols who also function as servants. They're made to be beautiful, to be pleasing, to orbit whoever they belong to. They don't have autonomy. They don't make their own choices. A pearl who doesn't have an owner is considered incomplete, an anomaly, not quite a proper being. Our pearl belonged to Pink Diamond, who later became Rose Quartz, and the relationship between them is, once the show unpacks it, quite thorny. Pink Diamond was the youngest and most impulsive of the diamonds, given Earth as her first colony and not particularly suited to ruling it. She wanted to protect Earth. The other diamonds wouldn't let her. She eventually created Rose Quartz as an alter ego, adopted a new form and a new name, and led the rebellion against herself, against Homeworld, against everything she was supposed to be. It's a complicated story and we could spend a whole other video on it. But here's the relevant part. Pearl went with her. Pearl helped her maintain the secret. Pearl helped her fight. And Pearl loved Pink Diamond, loved Rose Quartz with everything she had. That love was entangled with the way pearls are made, with the devotion that's essentially built into their nature. And Rose knew this. And the show eventually asks you to sit with the question of how much responsibility you bear when someone's love for you is at least partly the product of how they were created. Rose used Pearl. Not cruelly, not with malice, but she used her. Pearl kept secrets for her, put herself in danger for her, devoted thousands of years to her, and Rose accepted all of that devotion and gave Pearl a great deal in return, but never quite gave her the clarity that Pearl needed about what she was to Rose, whether she was loved as an equal or loved as a Pearl. In We Need to Talk, we see a flashback to the point when Greg Universe, a human musician, starts getting romantically involved with Rose. Greg is bewildered by how much Pearl resents him, and so Rose tries to explain to him that gems don't do relationships the way humans do. She says Pearl is her pearl, and Greg, who is not complicated, asks, but does Pearl know that? Which is a reasonable question. The scene the flashback is built around is Rose and Greg trying to communicate across the gap of their different natures, and Pearl is there. And at one point, Rose and Pearl fuse, right in front of Greg, basically as a demonstration of what Rose and Pearl have together that he can't access. It's not subtle. Pearl is in love with Rose, and Rose knows it, and she chooses to fuse with Pearl as a move in a conversation about her relationship with someone else. Rainbow Quartz, the fusion, is beautiful. She has 4 arms and a graceful, flowing quality, and an expression that suggests she is entirely comfortable being looked at. She says nothing. She just exists for a moment, and then they defuse. The show was written around this knowing everything it was going to reveal later, so the scene is doing double work. In the context of early season Steven universe, it looks like a fascinating glimpse into something we don't understand yet. In the context of everything the show eventually reveals, it's Rose using Pearl's devotion to make a point to Greg, without Pearl's full understanding of why she's being fused with in that moment, and Pearl being beautifully, willingly present for it anyway. The reason I think this belongs in a discussion of dark fusions is that it's a case where neither party is a villain, but something is still wrong. Rose isn't bad. Pearl isn't wrong to love her. The fusion itself isn't painful or forced or born of hatred. And yet the circumstances make it uncomfortable, because the show is asking, what does consent mean when one party has been designed for devotion? When the love itself is partially a product of how you were made, and the person you love knows this and doesn't address it? Pearl's arc across the entire show is partly about learning to be herself outside of devotion to Rose. It takes her a very long time. She transfers a great deal of that devotion to Steven, who is Rose's son and therefore carries Rose's legacy in him. That's its own complicated thing that the show handles carefully in future. There's a later fusion that speaks quietly to this. In Steven Universe Future, Pearl and Volleyball, who is Pink Diamond's other Pearl, the one Pearl didn't know existed, fuse together into something called Mega Pearl. It's a brief fusion, a practical one. They need more power in a moment of crisis, but the detail of it is striking. 2 Pearls, who were both shaped and somewhat diminished by their relationship with Pink Diamond, who were both left carrying things they didn't ask to carry, fusing together and finding that they can. That they have enough of themselves, enough selfhood outside of the diamond that made them, to fuse as their own entities and not just as extensions of someone else's orbit. The show doesn't make a large speech about this. It just lets the fusion happen and lets you notice what it means. Mega Pearl shows up, handles the problem, and the moment passes. But if you've been tracking Pearl's journey, the fact that she can fuse with another Pearl, with someone who shares the specific shape of her history, and that they produce something stable and functional, says something. She's gotten somewhere. This section has been about fusions that are uncomfortable for subtle reasons, for reasons that require context before they register as dark. But I think that's appropriate for Pearl's story, because Pearl's story is quiet in that way. Her worst moments aren't dramatic. They're the moments when she's been orbiting someone else so long that she's lost track of where she ends. There's one more fusion I want to mention briefly in this context, and then we'll close things out. Obsidian, the fusion of all 4 crystal gems, Steven included, appears in the 5th season finale when the gems need maximum power to climb the diamond's tower. Steven is part of Obsidian, which means a human is part of this gem fusion, which should by all rights be impossible. Obsidian is enormous and volcanic and ancient feeling, and she only exists for a few minutes. And then she's gone. The reason I want to mention her here is the context of everything we've covered tonight. All of the fusions we've talked about, the traumatic ones, the forced ones, the deceptive ones, they exist in the same universe as Obsidian, who forms when 4 beings who love each other and trust each other and have chosen each other come together with a common purpose. Obsidian is the full expression of what the crystal gems are, the proof of their solidarity, and she's only possible because of the work everyone in that group has done to understand and repair their relationships with each other. Garnet and Pearl had to work through Sardonyx. Garnet and Amethyst had to reckon with Sugalite. Pearl had to grieve and survive and eventually release her hold on Rose's memory. And then they can all become obsidian for a few minutes, and it works, and they climb the tower. That's the show's answer to everything we've covered tonight. Not that the dark fusions didn't happen, not that the damage isn't real, but that it's possible, with enough honesty and time to arrive somewhere worth arriving at. Let me spend a little more time on Pearl's arc here, because I think it deserves it. And because it's the kind of thing the show does quietly enough that you can miss what it's actually saying. Pearl's devotion to Rose is the emotional center of a huge portion of the show, even though Rose isn't present for any of it. Rose is dead. Or rather, she gave up her physical form to become Stephen. She's been gone for Stephen's entire life. And Pearl is still oriented around her. Still grieving her. Still living in the shadow of her absence. Still making decisions and forming relationships partly through the lens of what Rose would have thought or what Rose meant to her. That's a portrait of a specific kind of grief that the show handles with unusual care. It's not just sadness. It's the disorientation of losing the thing you were organized around. Pearl doesn't just miss Rose. She doesn't know who she is without Rose as a fixed point. The thousands of years she spent in Rose's orbit gave her a self, a purpose, a shape, and now that orbit has ended and she's working out what she is when nobody is defining her. And in that context, Sardonyx is enormously appealing to Pearl. Sardonyx lets Pearl be something in relation to Garnet, who is herself a love story, who is herself the embodiment of the thing Pearl lost. When Pearl is Sardonyx, she gets to exist in the gravitational field of something like what she used to have. It's not healthy, but it's completely understandable, and the show holds both of those truths at once. The original Rainbow Quartz, in this context, is a moment when Rose used Pearl's need to be in that gravitational field to achieve something unrelated to Pearl. She fused with Pearl in front of Greg to make a point to Greg. Pearl was, in that moment, a prop in someone else's conversation. And she probably felt it as the opposite of that, because being fused with Rose felt like being the most important thing in the world. That gap between what Pearl felt and what was actually happening is the most painful thing about their relationship. Pearl loved enormously and was loved back inadequately, and she never had the full clarity to understand the gap while it was happening. The show gives her that clarity slowly over years of storyline. The conversation in A Single Pale Rose where Stephen finally discovers the truth about Rose and Pink Diamond, and Pearl finally gets to tell someone, is one of the most cathartic moments in the series precisely because Pearl has been carrying so much for so long, with no one to put it down in front of. The healing that Pearl does in Future, the conversation with Volleyball, the Mega Pearl fusion, the way she begins to move through the world with a bit more selfhood and a bit less borrowed light, is the payoff of everything the show has been doing with her since the pilot. She's not fixed, she's not entirely over it, but she's somewhere she couldn't have been at the start. And the fact that she can fuse now in contexts that aren't about Rose, that she can fuse with Stephen and make Rainbow Quartz 2.0, who is lovely and capable and uses Pearl's spear as the handle of a parasol, which is extremely Pearl, suggests that fusion has become something she can inhabit cleanly, rather than something she's reaching for because she's lost. That's actually the measure of it, I think. Not whether you fuse or don't fuse, whether you're present for it. There's one more fusion I want to mention briefly in this context, and then we'll close things out. Obsidian, the fusion of all 4 crystal gems, including Stephen, appears in the 5th season finale when they need maximum power to climb the Diamond's Tower. Stephen is part of Obsidian, which means a human consciousness is woven into this ancient, enormous gem fusion. Obsidian is volcanic and huge and carries this quality of something primordial. And she only exists for a few minutes, and then she's gone. The reason I want to mention her here is the context of everything we've covered tonight. All of the fusions we've talked about, the traumatic ones, the forced ones, the deceptive ones, they exist in the same universe as Obsidian, who forms when 4 beings who love each other and trust each other and have chosen each other come together with a common purpose. Obsidian is what the crystal gems become when they have done the work. when Garnet and Pearl have worked through Sardonyx, when Garnet and Amethyst have reckoned with Sugalite, when Pearl has started to let go, when Stephen has grown into himself enough to be genuinely part of them rather than someone they're protecting. Obsidian is the proof that the work was worth it, not a refutation of everything dark we've covered tonight, but a destination made possible by the fact that everyone in that group was honest enough, eventually, to face what was wrong. That's very much the show's position on everything we've discussed. The dark fusions aren't the end of the story. They're what the story is made of. So, that's the dark side of fusion in Steven Universe. What I keep coming back to after all of that is how consistent the show's logic is across every scale. Whether it's Amethyst losing herself in Sugalite, or millions of shattered gems force fused into a weapon buried in the planet's core, the same principle is operating. Connection is powerful. That power can be used badly. The badness always looks like something, like someone who doesn't want to come back to themselves, or someone who was never given the chance to choose, or someone so afraid of their own feelings that they built a trap instead of a relationship. Rebecca Sugar has talked about the show being about the full range of what relationships can be, and I think that's accurate as far as it goes. But the more specific thing the show does, the thing that makes it worth spending hours thinking about, is that it's honest about how the things that make connection beautiful are exactly the same things that make it capable of going wrong. Fusion requires vulnerability. It requires trust. It requires a willingness to let another consciousness affect yours. All of those requirements can be met badly. All of them can be weaponized, deliberately or accidentally, by people who are afraid or desperate, or simply not thinking about the person they're fusing with. The show doesn't resolve into a simple message about any of this. It's not fusion is good, or some fusions are bad. It's something more careful and more true. It's that how you come together matters, why you come together matters, and whether both people are actually there, actually choosing, actually present with each other, rather than using each other as a mirror for something they need. Garnet, as always, is the answer the show keeps pointing at. Two beings who met under impossible circumstances and discovered something so true they couldn't walk away from it. That exists. The cluster also exists. Both of those things are made of the same act. There's something I'd like to cover in a future video that connects to a lot of what we talked about tonight, which is the broader history of Homeworld as a society and how it got to a place where things like the cluster were possible. That gets into the full Diamond Authority arc, the kindergartens, what Homeworld was doing to planets across the galaxy, and how gems came to understand themselves as resources rather than people. It's a long story with a lot of moving parts, and it deserves its own time. I'd also like to do something on the healthy fusions, properly, as a counterweight to tonight. Opal, who was Pearl and Amethyst finding something together that neither of them thought they had in common. Stefani. And what it meant for the show to put that fusion at the center of some of its most thoughtful coming-of-age episodes. Garnet's entire history, which is rich enough to fill several hours on its own. All of the crystal gem fusions and what they say about the group at different stages of their development. But that's for another quiet evening. For now, sleep well.